Hello everyone, this video started out as a lesson on painting a beautiful garden scene, but quickly became a focus on solving the problems we all create. Using some of these simple tips might calm the creative panic goes on in your head as stuff starts to go drastically wrong in your painting. Here's a reference photo from the location at Descanso Gardens. One of the problems I found in using the photograph is just so many seductive little details in it that with the light not changing, it's really easy to just sit there and get sucked up in all those like little details and textures that are there, and I keep having to remember that I have to simplify all of these different components in the composition. Ultimately, I have to remember that all those juicy leaf patterns and textures and shapes are in service of the whole composition and the whole scene, and so it's more important to get sort of an impression of it rather than the small details, even though, boy, I really do love those little details as I try to put them in here. So in my own head, I got this juggling act going on between the shapes of the different parts of the trees, the sky in the background, the way the light's hitting the forms, simplifying those shapes so they make more sense and they don't break apart into little puzzle pieces, and then trying to hold the whole composition together. That's why I picked the simplest area of the composition to start off with. Move over to the other side of the composition, you see I'm trying to keep those values really light and painting a lot more of those lighter areas than I should, because then I'll be putting darks over the top of it. And basically also creating a green backdrop for those maple trees that'll go into the foreground, along with the shapes of the rocks in the future as well. I didn't have enough time to make a full painting at the gardens, but I sat down and did a preliminary sketch with some painting notes on it. And you can see how I made some real compositional changes in the sizes of the trees, location of the rocks, even the shapes of the trees and the rocks to fit my composition in a way that I ultimately would allow me to paint it easier rather than just copying what I was seeing. I certainly have the photograph for reference, but I don't want to become a slave to the image. It's going to get me into trouble later on in the painting when I do try to copy too much of it rather than interpreting it. Now that I've punched those cool green trees in, I'm going to lay in the warm reddish colors of the maple trees on top of it. I really do love the character and the color of those maple trees, and I want to make sure that they become a focal point in my composition. But as you'll see that later on in the painting, they get completely lost in all the busyness of the trees and the shrubs around them, and I have to go back in and reinforce them. So I basically blocked them in using a real light orange creamy color to it as just sort of an underpainting just to get a handle on it. And then what I do is reinforce it with a more saturated orange red underneath that, or in a sense over the top of it. That more saturated warm color contrasting against the dark background will force those trees more into the foreground and make them a little bit more prominent. One of the nice aspects about gouache is that even though I'm painting this in dark, very dark in fact, and contrasting this, I know that I'm going to be going over the top of it with a lighter color, more of an impasto color, and going over the top of that dark to create more of a contrast between the plants in the foreground and the trees in back of them. Now, if you've ever seen any of my other videos, you'll know that I have a tendency to paint stuff a little bit more saturated first, knowing that I'm going to come over with different layers of paint over the top of it, and then sort of dull those colors down later on in the composition. I already know that in my own painting process that the background's a little bit too busy and a little bit too jumbled. And yes, I am a little bit panicked at this particular moment, but I also know that as I go through the painting process, this can all be changed. And so I'm not going to go in right away to try to fix it, even though I perhaps should. But I want to get all the components working together to see how the whole composition is put together and the whole value range before I go into complete panic mode and start to fix every little detail in it. So even as I paint this back dark ground, I'm already sort of projecting into the future and kind of in my own mind putting together the colors and the values that are going to be on those trees in the foreground. So when I was on the site, one of the things I really wanted to promote was this nice little kind of orange greenish bush down there. But at the same time, as I'm painting it, as I'm putting it together, I'm having sort of thoughts about what I promote. Should it be the shape? Should it be the color? Should it be the way that it wraps around the back of the tree? And frankly, I was a little bit confused at this point as I'm putting this together. And so I have all these different components kind of coming together at the same time causing me a lot of confusion. So rather than beating the tar out of it and getting even more frustrated, I decided to move on. I find that to be a good strategy sometimes, that even though you may be having a problem with something, you can always come back to it later after you've given your brain a little bit of time to sort of relax and figure out the problem in the back of your head while perhaps you're painting another element in your composition. So at this point, I'm going to briefly bring in the photograph of the pond. The photograph will be up just long enough you can see how I'm combining the reflections on the top of the pool as opposed to also using the refraction, the stones and the koi fish underneath it. But then I'm going to get rid of it because it becomes more of an annoyance than it becomes a help. Though perhaps you can't see it at this point, this is one of the big areas that I got myself in trouble with, is that I started to break the pool up more into, again, like little bits, looking at the sort of beautiful reflections and some of the textures and things, rather than looking at how it would help the entire composition, perhaps even in comparing the calmness of the water against the textural differences of the background and the trees. At this point, I'm starting to punch up the shadows coming off the trees to the left, and also the darker reflections on top of the water surface. What I perhaps should have done at this point is just get a larger brush out and block in the entire pond, showing more of the calmness of the settled area of the pond rather than the ripples and rather than all of the confusion of the reflections. But once again, like I said, it's really easy for me to pick on details and look at things that I perceive are going to help the composition rather than thinking of the original design aspect to keeping that simple instead. I think if I would have kept to those just large basic value shapes first and then come in there and not think about so much of, like, again, the juicy little details and all the little textures, which again I was sort of focused on, would have got me a lot farther along a lot sooner in this painting. One of the big larger problems that I made for myself is that I lost the objective of what the composition was about and what the subject matter was, rather than getting lost in those like little jewels of rocks and plants and textures that sort of sprung up that I felt that I had to sort of run from bushfire to fix, rather than thinking of the overall sort of focus of what I was in there to paint. This certainly can happen a lot more and become much more dangerous when you're plein air painting and the light and the weather is constantly changing. You have to sort of focus yourself around one objective when you're kind of laying in your painting. As I get frustrated and jump from area to area trying to fix things, I frequently have to step back and look at the whole composition and how the pieces relate to one another and be able to pull that all together. One of the big rules I have to keep reminding myself of is that I constantly think that if I just put enough detail into something, it's going to fix it, rather than being able to sort of walk away from it, look back, and understand that simplification and just hinting at stuff will do a lot more good than going in and trying to illustrate it. Perhaps here's a good case in point. You can see that from the drawing on site. I've changed the trees and moved it a little bit more to the left than the photographs. You also notice that I've shortened them up a little bit more, and instead of trying to copy the branches and the twigs and such, what I'm doing instead is just starting at them and just kind of finding the character of it and doing a lot of editing, probably painting all of about 1% of what I'm seeing, just to make it sort of dominate that corner of the composition more. Now I'm coming back into the maple trees here and accenting the lighter and darker areas on the composition. And you'll see that I'm hitting the lighter leaves as it points towards the sun. And then as I accent the more intense saturated reds of the maple tree, it's not so much the individual leaves, it's more the idea that I'm using the darker areas there to kind of show more the character of the tree as opposed to the flatter areas and shapes in the background. Now I'm going back to the tree and laying on the second layer of character, which comes into the smaller twigs, a little bit more of the texture on the leaf patterns. But again, you can see that I'm doing a lot of things where I'm just taking sort of the, like I said before, the simplicity of the tree and using that to describe a little bit more of the light up there, and then moving down into the trunks and the overlapping brushes to give it a little bit more depth. Perhaps you also notice that when I draw the branches, I don't really connect a lot of them. I give a little airspace between them. So again, they sort of drop into the background a little bit more. Or taking the texture on the tree, and rather than trying to copy it off the photograph, interpret it so it'll make the most sense when it comes to describing how it holds that corner of the composition. Once again, I have to remind myself that it's fun to work in all these like little details and things, but it's in service of a larger sense of the overall flow of your eye going through the composition rather than just painting trees. Having said that, here's a little detail of brushwork and the value and color differences in all of those different areas of those foliage back there. So perhaps at this point you'll notice I'm painting dark branches against a light background and light branches and trunks against a dark background. And now I'm just going to paint a little bit. I'm bringing up the photo reference again, so now you can see how much I've actually really changed a lot of the elements there, like bringing the trunk of the white tree down to the ground and lightening up a lot of the bushes in the back and getting rid of the bush next to the white tree on the maple tree on the right. Making a lot of these decisions again to help the spatial clues and identify what the objects are rather than just copying off the photograph. So another mistake I make at this point is I start going in here and drawing all these like really hardcore black or dark brown branches coming off these bushes and off these trees, and all of a sudden obviously realizing that they're beginning to take over that part of the composition. But once again, I don't panic because I know that later on I'm going to be coming over the top of that and adding sort of a darker green to the foreground a little bit more, that you can kind of get a little hints at that I'm also using to kind of push the background and the shapes of the stones out a lot more. So again, as you can see here, putting that green in, it sort of softens that area up and makes it descend like farther back in atmospheric perspective. That green also being a cooler color going over the top of that orange dampens that down a little bit and cools that off, as opposed to the more contrasty parts of the white trees or the trees to the left and the lit stones in the foreground. The important part about that is that even though I realized I made a mistake, I knew there was some sort of technique or some sort of methodology that would obliterate it or make use of it a little bit more better in the future. This idea of having several different techniques to fix mistakes settles your mind out when indeed stuff starts to go awry and fall apart in your painting. So I've had a little bit of time to think about this plant in the lower left-hand side of the composition, and what I'm planning on doing is using the darks that surround the plant to kind of block it in and to isolate it, make the shape a little bit more important. Once again though, I'm making the mistake of getting too concentrated in on the shape of the leaves and the foliage and not the shape of the entire plant, also getting lost a little bit in the color as well. So ultimately the solution came down to strengthening up the plant shape by using the darks to sort of silhouette the bigger form, and then coming back in and also simplifying the color usage, so getting rid of the bright oranges and then mixing those into the greens and making it a little bit more flat at this point. Frankly, at this point, I'd love to give you one brilliant solution that would solve all my problems here, but that's just not going to happen, because what I'm doing at this point is trying several different options and seeing which one works the best. And then at the same time, like I've said before, not trying to completely panic my way into making even more mistakes. At this point, I'm also going to be using the shadow coming off the tree to silhouette those lit up rocks in the foreground, just slightly behind that bush. Well, then once again, I'm using a really bad habit that I always sort of fall into. It's the fact if I just paint enough little dabs for leaves, it'll pull the texture of that plant more into the foreground. And what it does is it actually breaks the shape up and doesn't make it as recognizable. Ultimately, it does exactly the opposite of what was intended. It creates a visually noisy area that distracts the eye rather than helps anchor it. So you see, by the time we hit the end of the painting, I'll chunkify this, simplify it a lot, and then pull off the idea of that bush shape up against the spikiness of the flower plants down there in the very corner of the composition. Perhaps it's not the smartest thing for me to do in a video, but what I'm trying to do at this point is take every trick in the book and throw it at this section of the painting to get it to work. And you can see the next minute or so me overlaying several different techniques in here just to get it to work, and flailing quite nicely on several parts of it. But that's ultimately a good thing, because if you can look into your own painting and see the successes and the failures and what works and what doesn't, you can actually become like a really good chef and be able to take all these different techniques and put it into your own sort of recipe to determine what best ingredients would make a really good meal or a really successful painting. That's what I'm really struggling to do at this point. Getting a bit frustrated at the results in the process, but having a good time as I'm doing it. Because ultimately I'll come up with some solution that will become successful. Now I'm adding a little bit of the sky reflections into the pond for that blue to move your eye through the plant and then into the pond, and then across the ripples on the surface of the pond and into the rocks and the plants on the right hand side of the composition. If you've seen my other landscape painting videos, you've seen my palette, my colors, and how I do my color mixings on that palette. What I'm doing at this point is reinforcing the time of day and light by using sort of a white mixture with a little bit of orange on top of the rocks to reintroduce the idea that's like probably around about 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The raking light is starting to throw some cast shadows off it, but nothing too drastic at this point. It's still reinforcing the upper part of the objects in the composition. The top planes of the boulders, the trees, or the bushes, or even the surface of the water, though it will end up looking pretty dark by the time I finish it. I'm bringing the photo reference back in, so now you can see that now what I'm going to do is hit the opposite side of the rocks and start to reinforce the solidity by using the cast shadows and the form shadows to again sort of knock in a little bit more of the perimeters of the pond that's there. I left the pond to the last because ultimately that's what attracted me to this composition, was the tranquilness and the quietness of that meditative pool. But having said that, I forgot that, and now once again I'm getting sucked into painting all the reflections of the maple trees and the sky and the ripples that are there, and it's starting to compete with all the rest of the stuff in the composition. Now at the time I was thinking to myself, wow, this is really cool, I love all these ripples, I love painting all of this surface tension that's in this water, and it'll get the viewer's eyes to move through one section of ripples into another into the background. But ultimately it just became busy work. It defeated the design and the spatial depth within the composition. But boy, I sure loved painting it though. At the time I thought it was working really well. You might also notice that I'm using a lot of effects and a lot of the different pieces of information from the photograph, whether it's the ripples or whether that's that shadow coming across the pond. The problem is, and I didn't realize it at the point, was that it was distracting from the overall composition. It's also not to say this necessarily a bad painting at this point. I use a lot of these techniques in a lot of other water paintings that I've done if you've seen previous demo videos that I've put up, but it's just too busy at this point, and I didn't realize it until I finished it, put it down, gave it a little bit of time to sort of get myself away from it, and then came back and looked at it, as you can see here in the supposedly completed painting. In the next session of this video lesson, I'll show you how I fixed the problems that I made for myself But I'm going to break this into sections for you so you can take a look at some of the finer details and some of the problem solving in these 7 by 9 inch sections of the painting. I've said it before, there's a lot of problems in painting this section of water, but there's still some good techniques on the inside of here that I learned from and perhaps you can learn from. And here's that pesky bush that I had so much trouble with, and yes, it looks a little bit overwrought at this point, but when you pull back and look at the whole composition, I think it works well. So needless to say, after giving it a rest and coming back and looking at it, the big red warning lights went on, and I knew there was something I had to change. So the big solution was to simplify stuff and go back into the narrative again about having this calm, reflective pool, meditative pool that ultimately could compare and contrast the shapes and the colors of the background of the foliage, the trees, and the bushes. So I really didn't even mix new colors. I just took a large wet brush and went in, and instead of painting across the pond, I painted the reflections vertically, again to sort of contrast it with the other textures and shapes that I have in the other parts of the composition. The hard part is that I really do like painting ripples in the water, and I was really attached to what I had painted there, so getting ready and editing all of this stuff out of here was hard to do. You can see that as I go back and sort of still hint at where all of those like curving ripples are and some of those little surface texture areas are, but ultimately I had to get rid of like about 85-90% of what I painted and just come down to a few little areas of blue with some white speckles that where the rocks sort of attached to the water and where those like little glistening beads of light sort of reflect off the surface of the water. You might notice in this next section, next fade here, that I'm really reluctant to get rid of those ripples right underneath that tree. And eventually I just had to pull the trigger and then take that little bit of green and then just get the reflections off the trees in the background and pull it right across the pond to unify, again, that larger shape and larger volume of the pond surface. But ultimately I think the results are a heck of a lot better. And here's a video so you can compare it against the real deal. So at this point I'll bring the painting back so you can look through it one last time and make comparisons against the photographs and the final painting and even the changes I made. So in closing, I'd like to thank everybody for looking at the video, and here's my contact information, and feel free to please leave a comment and like the video and follow the channel, subscribe to it, and thank you very much for coming, and I'll see you later. Adios. Bye.